Hello and welcome to the Emmanuel Croydon podcast. At Emmanuel Croydon, we exist to be a community drawn together by our desire to know and follow Jesus. We long to become disciples of Jesus who are equipped to serve him in the whole of life, transforming families, communities and workplaces as we love God with heart, mind, soul and strength. We hope you enjoy this week's talk from the morning services. Thank you for joining us today. Grace and peace to you.
How have you been managing during the restrictions of the last few weeks? Are you missing the freedom that you once had? Do you miss being able to visit your family, hug your granny, fall in love, or go for a walk without taking a tape measure with you? Do you miss being able to come to church, or go to a hairdresser, or to the theatre, or a football match, or maybe go on holiday? I guess so. Maybe it's worse than that. Maybe you're now struggling with your income in a way that you hadn't before. Things may be getting tense at home with all the family there. Maybe you've become a victim of the virus, or a friend or a member of your family has. Oh, just to go back to last February, things seemed to be going so smoothly then. Oh, for that freedom that we seem to have lost. Well, if you miss the freedom that you once had, listen to the words of the psalmist in Psalm 137 that Marion's going to read to us.
By the rivers of Babylon we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. There on the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captives asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not consider Jerusalem my highest joy. Remember, O Lord, what the Edomites did on the day Jerusalem fell. Tear it down, they cried, tear it down to its foundations. O daughter of Babylon, doomed to destruction, happy are those who repay you for what you have done to us, those who seize your infants and dash them against the rocks.
Reading of that psalm, I wonder how you felt about it. It started with that verse that's been turned into a song with a rather catchy tune, By the Rivers of Babylon. But by the end, maybe you were asking, what on earth is a psalm like that doing in the Bible? The psalmist is wanting infants to be dashed against rocks. How can that be acceptable? It's a good question, and we should be looking at the Christian response to that later. First of all, though, let's consider the background. The psalm was written after the Babylonian exile. If you remember, in 587 BC, the Babylonians destroyed the city of Jerusalem, with most of the inhabitants being carted off to Babylon in what is now Iraq. And they were there for about 70 years or so, until the Babylonians themselves were overrun by the Medes and Persians, who let the exiles return to Jerusalem. Babylon wasn't actually a bad place to live as such. It had canals built across a huge plain which was green and prosperous. And the Jews had quite a bit of freedom, which was good. But the main problem was, it wasn't home. Jerusalem had been their home, and the temple in Jerusalem had been the centre of their religion, and they were having to live with people who had destroyed their home. And the psalmist is remembering how awful it had been there. This psalm was written probably shortly after their return, and the emotions were still quite raw. They had experienced profound homesickness, grief, depression and despondency while they'd been in Babylon. The Hebrew musicians would sit with their harps by the banks of the river to play praises to God, as they loved to do, and the Babylonians would come along and jeer at them, taunting them, ordering them to sing happy songs about Zion, and they couldn't. It was an ignorant, arrogant insult. I mean, you can't sing with reverence while the Babylonians are mocking and jeering you. It would be sacrilegious. How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land, cries the psalmist. He moves on in his psalm from remembering the awfulness of the time in exile to the identity of the people who had caused the misery. The Edomites had been there, cheering the Babylonians on as they destroyed Jerusalem, urging the Babylonians to tear down those walls and flatten the city. The Edomites had been traditionally enemies of the Judeans. They were originally descendants of Esau, who of course had sold his birthright to Jacob many years before. They lived on the east side of the river Jordan, in what is now the country of Jordan. And to see those Edomites delighting in Jerusalem's downfall would have been an utter humiliation for the Jews. But the big culprit was Babylon itself. By the time this psalm was written, Babylon had been overrun by the Medes and Persians. So when the psalmist says, "O daughter of Babylon, doomed to destruction," he already knows that Babylon's been defeated, and he's delighting in it. The anger that's been building up as he's been writing this psalm is reaching a crescendo and explodes in the last two verses. Happy are those who repay you for what you've done to us, those who seize your infants and dash them against the rocks. As I said, very, very strong language for a book in the Bible, and at the centre I see two very powerful emotions: anger at the situation that they'd had to face, and a desire for revenge. And what I'd like to do is ask the question, what should the Christian response be to these emotions? And to answer that question, of course, we need to look to the New Testament. First of all, anger. Maybe many of us are feeling angry about our current situation. The feeling of helplessness that we may have only serves to add to that. The first step is to accept that anger is a very real emotion. An American psychiatrist and author, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, identified it as one of the 5 stages of bereavement. Firstly, denial, then anger, then bargaining, in all likelihood with feelings of guilt, then fourthly, depression, and then finally, acceptance. It doesn't necessarily relate solely to bereavement relating to somebody's death. It could well relate to any form of loss that we've suffered. And there are 2 types of anger. There's the anger at somebody else's situation, but there's also uncontrolled anger, which lashes out in all directions. Let's consider the former for a moment. We see a situation that a person or maybe groups of people are experiencing, and it makes us angry at their suffering. And that's quite justified. It's known as righteous anger. We see an element of that in what the psalmist is writing about in this psalm. I mean, he's talking quite a bit about the experience of his fellow countrymen rather than himself. The exile took 70 years or so, and they are already home, so he's not likely to have been one of the original exiles. In fact, he may never have experienced Jerusalem before. But he's heard the stories, and he's angry at what his forebears had to suffer. Jesus got angry from time to time. He healed somebody with a shriveled hand on the Sabbath, and the synagogue members were more intent on catching Jesus out than rejoicing that the man was healed. And we read, he looked round at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts. Obeying a few rules was more important to them than the man being healed. Was it any wonder that he was angry? We may see the plight of refugees who are being forced to leave their own country by some evil regime, and it makes us angry. We need to be angry about injustice and wrongs being done to our fellow human beings. But the other sort of anger needs to be carefully controlled. I mean, when we get angry, often at a perceived injustice to ourselves, there's a great danger it consumes our life. And maybe the stress causes us to have serious health problems. I mean, high blood pressure, heart disease, headaches, stomach problems, ulcers, colitis, insomnia. They've all been linked at times with unresolved anger. Maybe we've been hurt by someone or experienced loss, grief or bereavement. Maybe the underlying problem goes back many years and the anger won't let us go. We lash out, maybe doing great harm in the process. We see an element of this kind of anger in the psalm that we're looking at today. Paul, when he was writing to the Ephesians, tells them, in your anger, don't sin. Don't let the sun go down while you're still angry. And don't give the devil a foothold. James too emphasised this sort of anger has to be got under control. Everyone should be quick to listen and slow to speak and slow to become angry. For human anger does not bring about the righteous life that God desires. These aren't useful suggestions, they're scriptural commands. They aren't denying the existence of anger, but they're saying it must be kept under control. Well, it's fine to be told that you must keep anger under control, but for many it's not easy. If you're having a rough time, if you're feeling angry about your circumstances, as you may well be, tell God about it. He's the person to shout at. Rant and rave if you want to. He's big enough to handle that. It might not be the nicest way to approach God, but it's better than venting your anger on other people. And if we do that, we're not going to catch God out. He knows us already. He's not going to be shocked. In Psalm 139, 2 psalms on from where we are today, the psalmist is saying, "O Lord, you've searched me and you know me. You know where I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you know it completely." Share your anger with God. Talk to him about it. Ask him to help you with the underlying problem and help you control your anger. He can and he will. I said that there were two emotions I wanted to talk about. The first was anger. When anger gets out of hand, it often leads to a desire for revenge. And sadly, this is where the writer ends up in this psalm. He glories in the destruction of Babylon that has recently taken place, but also in whoever seizes the Babylonian infants and dashes them against the rocks in repayment for what the Babylonians have done. If this sounds awful, indeed it is. One could say in very slight mitigation of the psalmist, and it is very slight mitigation, that in verse 7 he's pleading with God to take revenge. He's not suggesting he's going to do it himself. And he's probably only following the Old Testament principle of eye for eye and tooth for tooth. I guess the Babylonians had treated the Judean children badly over the years. Dashing to pieces the little ones was a common enough sequel to a heathen victory. But that's as far as my sympathy goes for him. There is a better way, the way of Jesus. It's learning to live with our enemies, or more accurately, learning to love our enemies. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbour and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. It seems impossible. But Jesus would never have commanded it if we'd been unable to do it. You know, behind every command that Jesus gave is a hidden promise, because God will never ask us to do something without giving us the power to do it. There's a story in the New Testament where Jesus is outside Lazarus' tomb. He's been dead several days, and Jesus says, "Lazarus, come out." Now that's actually asking quite a lot of a dead man. An impossible command, you might say. But Lazarus did come out because Jesus gave him the power to do so. So when Jesus gives us an instruction to love our enemies, which includes forgiving them, the question is not, can we, but will we? There's a very good reason why Jesus tells us to love our enemies, because God does. He wants our enemies to turn to him and know him in their lives on a day-to-day basis and experience eternal salvation just as much as he wants it for us. Paul told the Romans, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. That was the love and forgiveness that he showed to us. And he did it because he wanted everyone to turn to him and be forgiven. And if we don't love and forgive our enemies, we're really denying that such a God exists. Jesus said that we're to pray for our enemies. And he didn't mean that we should pray for fire and brimstone to be cast down on them. He meant that we should pray blessings on them. Pray for the very best for them. And if we do that, of course, then they don't stay enemies very long. There's another reason why we should not wish appalling things on our enemies, as the psalmist was doing, and that is because one day Jesus will come again, and, as he has said, there will be a time of judgment, and wrongs will be put right. If there are people who have done wrong to us, if they've not repented of that wrong, they will be dealt with at that time. Help, you might say. Does that mean that all the things I've done wrong will be punished? Well, that's a good question, but Jesus said, those who hear my word and believe him who sent me have eternal life and will not be condemned. They have crossed over from death to life. Forgiveness is freely available to us by the grace of God, and that forgiveness is freely available to our enemy too, if they want it. And our attitude should be to not want our enemies to be punished, but to want them to freely receive that same gift of grace that we have received. So forgive those who have offended you and leave the judgment to Jesus. So are you feeling angry today or wanting revenge? This virus problem's given us plenty of things, plenty of people that we might be feeling angry about. Politicians, scientists, medical advisors that we might think have got it wrong. Angry about shops that are making us queue for a long time. Maybe we're even angry about other countries that have introduced this problem to us. We might be angry about our financial circumstances because they're nothing like as healthy as they were. We might be angry about our lack of freedom. We've lost so much of the power that we had. But you know, our faith is based on weakness. Paul told the Corinthians how God had told him, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. It was because he had to trust in God rather than in his own strength. Jesus was, to quote Hebrews, made perfect through suffering. Yeah, I know we prefer to be made perfect through success, but grace won't do for us what it didn't do for Jesus, exempt us from suffering. When all this virus business is over, things won't be the same as they were before. When the Jews got back to Jerusalem after the exile, things weren't the same. They had a lot of rebuilding to do. And so shall we have to with the parts of our society that are broken. But we have to bring our anger and our desire for revenge maybe to God and ask for his peace in our lives. And maybe we need to remember Paul's words to the Philippians. In everything, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus.
Thanks for listening to the Emmanuel Croydon podcast. For more information about our church and everything we have going on, visit our website, emmanuelcroydon.org.uk. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram to see and hear what's going on in the life of our church. God bless you and have a wonderful week.